This video is all about when you should not be shooting log footage and a little bit about when you should. If you're new here, my name is Jeven Dovey. I do a lot of filmmaking tutorials, a bunch of camera reviews, some cool adventure stuff. And today we're talking about log footage and if it's something that you should shoot. More and more today, cameras are coming out with the capabilities to shoot log. What log is a flattened image. But the reason that you shoot log footage is to preserve the highlights and to preserve the darks. So what it does is it basically flattens out your exposure so you're shooting right in the middle of highlights and darks. And what that does is it preserves your dynamic range, and every camera has a specific dynamic range native to the camera. So it might be 14 stops, it might be 16, it might be 18, whatever your camera may have, and there's a specific range of the amount of stops of light that your sensor will pick up. Now, log preserves the most amount of steps within that dynamic range. When you shoot something like standard, your highlights are gonna blow out faster, your darks are gonna get crushed. So the reason that you shoot log is to preserve your highlights and to preserve your darks so that later you can color grade it and get more exposure so your skies aren't white, they're blue now. Or for example, your shadows aren't completely black, you actually have something in the shadows. That's when you would use log. However, I have 6 reasons why you should not be shooting log footage. The first is bitrate. So bitrate is basically boiled down the quality of the file that it is that you're shooting. So if you're shooting an 8-bit file versus say a 10-bit file, there's actually less data in that file, so it's harder to color grade. When you have an image that's shot at 8-bit and you're trying to push the colors around and the exposure around, you're gonna introduce a lot of noise, you're gonna introduce what's called banding, and that's when the colors create these bands in, say, the sky. And so it has a lot more issues when you try to grade it. So one reason you wouldn't shoot it is just the bit rate that's coming out of your camera. So that's something you need to understand. If you're shooting lower quality footage, then you shouldn't necessarily be shooting log. For example, in the GH5, I have an option to shoot 400 megabytes, 10-bit footage, which grades very nicely, or you can shoot 100 megs 8-bit footage and it's not as easy to grade. It actually breaks apart a little quicker so you don't have as much range when you're editing. The second reason you shouldn't shoot log is it introduces noise into your image. It introduces more noise because you're bringing up your blacks. And anytime you bring up your blacks, you introduce noise into your footage. So if you're shooting flat and your blacks are towards the middle of your exposure, you're introducing a lot more noise than if you'd shot at a standard profile where the blacks are down where they should be. Different cameras will introduce a different level of noise, so it just depends on what camera that you're using. Okay, the third reason is it takes more time to grade, and that's obvious. You're now adding on another stage of the editing process, and if you're just creating videos that need to get out quick, this is not something that you want to add onto your workflow. It just takes time to grade and get your footage to where you want it to be. Now, if you're interested in grading quick, I do have a video all about that. I'll put it up in the card up here. So check that out. It's the quickest way I've found to grade my footage if I'm just trying to use log footage for the aspects of being able to preserve the highlights and darks, but be able to pump things out quick so I'm not spending forever grading footage. All right, number 4 depends on your gear, which is it's harder to monitor when you're out in the field. So if you're shooting log and you're looking at this flat image while you're out shooting, you really don't have a sense of your image and it's harder to actually compose your shots and see focus and things like that. Now, there are ways that you can use external monitors that allow you to add a LUT so you can get something close and be able to have a burnt-in image, but it's not being recorded to the actual footage. There's also tools within your camera. Some will allow you to add LUTs. Some will have a preset kind of LUT that basically just gives you more contrast in your image so that you're able to monitor it, but still they don't work that well compared to shooting in like a standard profile. Something to keep in mind, it is a little bit harder to monitor log footage when you're shooting. Okay, the 5th reason you wouldn't shoot log footage is that you're in a low contrast scene. So if you're shooting and there's not crazy highlights, there's not crazy darks, you don't necessarily need to shoot log footage. Log is giving you the ability to preserve your dynamic range, but if you don't need to preserve that dynamic range, there's not that many exposure values in the footage that you're shooting, then you might not need to shoot logs. Number 6 goes right along with that, and that is you're controlling your lighting. For example, right now I have lit this room, I've blacked out the windows, I've used all my own lights, I've completely controlled the lighting in this shot. And so because of this, I don't need to use log. I can use a burnt-in image, start editing, not have to worry about that another phase of editing, which is color grading, because I've controlled the lighting. So if you're controlling the lighting and you're shooting a project, you don't necessarily need to have that dynamic range because you're not dealing with a huge range. You can control how it looks. So I would not shoot log in this setting. Now, if I'm shooting and there's, say, like a window behind me, then I would probably use log. I would want to preserve the exposure that's outside, and it's gonna be very different than what's in this room. So if you control your lighting, if you control your settings, then you don't necessarily have to shoot log. It will speed up your workflow. If you don't need to color grade your footage as much, I would say don't shoot log. But if you're going into a heavy color grade, if you're going into a very specific look, then I would say use log footage. And also if you're trying to preserve highlights and the details within your highlights and your darks, then I would shoot log. But otherwise, you don't necessarily need it. I run a production company, and a lot of the stuff that we shoot, I never shoot in log format because I don't need to preserve the highlights because I'm controlling the light. If I'm in a studio, I can completely control it. And if something's too bright in the image, I'll bring down a light instead of trying to bring it down in post. The biggest piece of advice is control as much as possible in camera so that when it comes time to edit, you're not just leaving it for post, because not everything gets fixed in post, and sometimes it takes a lot more time to fix it in post. All right, guys, that is it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you want to see some cinematic editing tutorials, check out the videos right here. I've got a playlist all about that. Or if you want to see another video from my channel, check out that down there. And guys, that is it. I will see you on the next one.